slides? Can you share?
Oh, want me
Have
to
we
share
made?
right away? Yep. Oh, I cannot share.
We just need to be made co-hosts.
I'm making you a co-host.
Yeah.
I'm making everybody co-hosts.
Thank you. Great. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, everybody.
Perfect. Welcome, everyone. My name is Naomi Devine. I'll introduce myself a little bit more momentarily, but for now I'd like to invite my colleague Kiana to help explain how you can get into Mentimeter, which will be the tool that we're using tonight to receive feedback interactively. Kiana.
Sure. Good evening, folks. So as Naomi mentioned, my name is Kiana. So on your screen right now, you'll see something that says how to join Menti. So basically, it's a tool that we use today to get your thoughts and your opinions on the various questions I'll have later on in today's session. And it's also another way to engage with us as well virtually. So first things first, you can open another browser or you can grab your phone, whatever is easiest for you. And it just asks you to either one, type go to menti.com and then enter that code there. That's one way. Second way is to take a picture of the QR code. So that's probably more easier if you're using a phone. And lastly, there's also a link that will be quickly put into the Zoom chat right now. Oh, thank you. So Naomi has also put in a Menti link in the Zoom chat. So when you click that link, that should automatically send you to Menti or our Menti session. If you're unable to get in, please let us know in the Zoom chat and we'll help you with any troubleshooting.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Kiana. All right. Let's go to our next introduction slide.
Perfect. While we're there, let's kick it over to the county to introduce themselves or kick it off here.
All right. Thank you. Good evening, folks. My name is Evan Polk, and I am Clackamas County's Sustainability and Solid Waste Program Manager. And I'm pleased to be here today to listen in to the conversation and what members of our community have to say about this project. With me today from the county are Sarah Allison, an analyst on our team, and Ellen Roglin with our Public and Government Affairs Department. So welcome to them as well. We are here today to talk more about the project that is a goal of our Board of Commissioners to adopt a climate action plan with specific actions to reach the goal of being carbon neutral by 2050. And that's what we're oriented around this evening. In front of you on the screen, if you have the ability to see that, is the county's land acknowledgement. We felt it would be important to share, although I won't read it out loud this evening. So with that note of welcome and appreciation that you're here, I will hand it back to the SSG team.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So welcome, everyone. I'm going to go over today's agenda. We have an action-packed and jam-packed agenda for you, lots of information to share and questions for you to get your feedback. So we're in the welcome and introductions portion of the meeting this evening. We're going to go into a project overview and explain what the project looks like from a high level. We've got a climate action game to play with everyone tonight to get you warmed up in Mentimeter and have some fun. We're going to go over climate action or climate planning 101 and what that means. We'll dive into Clackamas County's greenhouse gas inventory. It sort of sets the baseline understanding for where the greenhouse gas emissions are coming in the community. We'll take a look at Clackamas County's business as planned future. So what do emissions look like with the policies and actions already in place? And then we're going to have a facilitated discussion at that point after that. And we'll wrap up with next steps and an evaluation for you of tonight's session. If at any time you do have a question, please do put it into the chat as well, and we'll try and answer it in the chat live, or we'll save it for the facilitated discussion and we'll sort of bring it up then. If we don't get to every question tonight, not to worry, we're gathering the questions as well, and the questions and answers will also be placed on the project website. Let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so let's do who's in the room. So we'd like to hear from you as well. So as Kiana mentioned, there's a few ways to get into Mentimeter, which will come up on the next slide. And I'm just going to place the direct link in the chat again. So we want to know who you are. So just have everyone say hello. So if you want to introduce yourself in Mentimeter by sharing your name and your role and a department or unit if it applies, or if you don't, that's okay. You can just share your name with us. We'd like to know who's with us. Hi, Becky. Good to have you back. And if anyone's having trouble getting into Mentimeter, just let us know in the chat as well. We'll be happy to help you out. Hi, Gail. Nice to meet you. Welcome.
Yes, hi, Marty. I see that you put your name down in the Q&A for Menti.
So there, I've just put mine in there as well. So once you go to that link, you've just got a little box that you can just put your answer in there. Becky, are you able to get into Mentimeter? And Gail, are you also able to get in? And if you raise your hand, I can unmute you as well if you want to let us know outside the chat. Oh, no problem. No problem. Glad you can get in. We just want to make sure you can so that when we ask the questions later on too, we can get your feedback that way so we don't miss anything. We'll just take a few more seconds with this and then we'll go on. If you can't get in, introduce yourself in the chat and we'll help you at the next spot in the meeting where we're going to use Mentimeter. So we've got 2 people in, so we need 2 more to get in. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Thanks everyone for that. So we have a question for you coming up next. We'd like to know which is better, cake or pie? And with this, you'll get to see as soon as you put in the answer, you'll see what happens live on the screen. Okay, Gail says pie. I'm going to submit an answer for you there, Gail. Thank you for that. There we go. And I see we've had someone else join us as well. Welcome this evening. I'm Naomi. I'll be your facilitator for this evening. And in the chat for tonight, we've got a link to Mentimeter, which is what you see on the screen, so you can participate live in the meeting and give us feedback. So if you click on that, that'd be great. If you can't get in, please let us know and we'll help you out. If you're not sure where the chat is to find where these links are being placed, it's at the bottom bar on Zoom. So you'll see a variety of options there, and there's a little chat icon as well. All right, so Cake is pulling into the lead. I think we've got all 3 people who've answered, so that's great in there. Let's go to the next question. Okay, next slide, sorry. So we've got some operating values for tonight's meeting. So these are tried and true guidelines that help us have successful public discussions with each other. So for tonight, we will show respect for each other by using respectful language, sharing information, and listening to each other's perspectives. We will ask questions in the chat during presentations. So if you've you can get into the chat there if you have issue with that, raise your hand and we'll help you out with that. We want to balance airtime to hear from as many voices as possible. We want to be curious and challenge our own assumptions and biases and be open to building on each other's suggestions or taking the conversation in another direction, of course, if you wish. Is there anything else that you would like to add? If so, feel free to raise your hand and let me know or place it in the chat. Okay, fantastic. Let's go to our next slide. And so just before we get into today's session objectives, I realized I skipped over introducing our team as well. So I'm Naomi Devine, I mentioned. I am a Senior Consultant and Climate Action Planner with SSG and our engagement lead. And I'd like to also turn it over to my colleague Brittany to introduce herself now.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Brittany McLean. I'm a Senior Consultant with SSG as well. I'm the lead analyst on this project, and so I'm working closely with the county project team. And I'm going to kick it over to Kiana.
Everyone, my name is Kiana, also part of the project team, and I mostly do my work around engagement.
Great, thank you so much. So for our session objectives tonight, we're here to consult on implementation options to move forward with climate action in Clackamas County. So the presentations tonight are going to give you the information that you need to give us some feedback and to involve all interested parties and community members in understanding community values, aspirations, and the climate readiness for the climate action plan. Next slide, please. All right, and Brittany's going to talk a little bit about who we are at SSG as a whole.
Yeah, so SSG is a 25-member worker cooperative. I can officially announce that now that we've put it out to our clients today that we've just merged with our sister company, What If Technologies, that we've worked with over the last 7 years, and that we've worked on over 100 climate action plans with. We're a pretty diverse group of folks, so project managers, facilitators, modeling experts, engineers, graphic designers, data visualizers, and all that comes together to provide a very holistic approach around climate action planning. The way we like to approach climate action planning is to redefine it really as whole community planning. So we look at everything from land use to demographics, to where and how energy is being used throughout the community and how that influences emissions. We like to demonstrate the magnitude of the effort required. So we do use a modeling process in our work, and I'm going to explain that through this evening's presentation. We also demonstrate that the effort is worth doing and that it's compelling. So in our work, we also look at the co-benefits to taking climate action, things like improved air quality, and we look at the financial impact. And often for a lot of the actions that we suggest for communities do have a financial return and payback. And we also include those most affected by the outcome at every step. So our lovely engagement team is here this evening, or part of our engagement team, and they're with us throughout our entire projects to help engage stakeholders and the public throughout these climate action plans. I'm going to jump in now to a little bit about the process. Basically, what is the Clackamas County Climate Action Plan? So you have a sense of the project. So basically, the Climate Action Plan is for the whole community, all of Clackamas County and the internal county operations. And it's going to identify opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increase climate resilience, and identify sequestration opportunities. And the Board of Commissioners set a target to be carbon neutral by 2050. So that's sort of our guiding star. We know that where we're headed with this plan. The process looks a little bit like this. So I'll explain in more detail where we're at as we go. You'll get a good sense of what has happened so far. But basically, we went through a discovery phase where we were gathering data and developing the models that I've talked about. And then developing, we're now in the phase of really developing criteria, trying to understand, how do we reach carbon neutral in Clackamas County? What does that look like? Who's involved? Who pays? All of those pieces. And then after that, we're going to go through a number of feedback and refinement cycles, and then that will go back to the Board of Commissioners. We adopt it, we hope, and then we implement it within the community. And throughout that process, as you can see, we are doing some community engagement, including a community advisory task force of community members that are helping us develop the plan along the way. All right, so I'm going to pass it back over to Kiana now, and we are going to play a climate action game. And this is meant to it tests your knowledge about climate change a little bit, but just to get you thinking, maybe challenge some assumptions, or to just be thinking about climate change in different ways. So yeah, over to you.
Thank you. So as Naomi has said in the chat, and for those of you who are not logged into or connected to Menti, you can use that link to access it, as well as open another tab, or even on your phone, you can open your browser and type in menti.com and use the code at the top of the screen there. So 1266 9524 or 9524. So once we get a few folks in, I'll give you guys about 30 seconds. In a bit. I see a heart. Okay, awesome. We have some reaction there. I know you're in. Again, Naomi has dropped the Menti link in the Zoom chat. And it's just a great way for us also just to, loosen up before we talk more a bit about climate change.
Yeah, that's a good point, Kiana. We've got a really information-heavy meeting, this evening too. So this will be a little bit of fun.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Ray. Welcome. Okay. Ray, are you able to get into Menti? Can you click on the link and let me know? So our first question is, how ready are you for climate action? So you've got a set of choices there, multiple choice, that you can let us know. Ooh, all right. Here we go.
Okay, also that's her pretty ready.
Yeah, I've got a ready crowd. That's wonderful to see. Okay, next question.
Oh, you can skip that.
Yeah. We have a leftover slide from last time. It's okay. Here we go. All right, what is a climate emergency? We've got a multiple choice questions here for you. So is it when you're dressed for the wrong climate? When governments declare climate change is more severe than initially anticipated? Or when emergency personnel declare a heat wave is more severe than anticipated? What do you think? And if you were in it before, I think, yeah, you want to make sure you keep the browser open too, because we've got lots of questions in Mentimeter for you. All right, got a few answers here. Wonderful. Okay, Kiana, want to take us to the answer to the question?
Yep. All right, so for those of us, many of us said that climate emergency is essentially when a government body or different levels of government has announced that climate change is actually more severe than initially anticipated. And actually throughout North America, over 600 different municipalities, provincial, territorial, state, federal governments have actually declared a climate emergency and right now taking action to address it. Next slide. All right, so we also have a multiple choice questions here as well. So the question really is asking, how much will climate inaction cost us globally? So we have $178 million, $178 billion, and lastly, $178 trillion. So you see our bubbles in the trillions.
Gosh, trillions. It's hard to get your mind around trillions, isn't
I
it?
know. Okay, go to the next slide.
All right, we got a consensus on the answer there.
Mm-hmm. So yes, it actually is the $178 trillion. So there was actually a study done by well, I'm making my acronyms messed up. Deloitte, where they actually looked at what is the cost of climate inaction. And basically what that research found is that climate action is actually way better investment than just waiting for something to happen. So you go on to the next slide, please. This is also a true or false question. So there is no point in doing anything if China isn't. Okay, I see 3 people have voted. 4. All right. So most of us agree, yes, it's false. So again, it's not about pointing fingers or putting blame. And also recognizing that, again, while China may be one of the world's largest emitters of GHG, they're also one of the world's largest investors. And it's also to recognize that many of the things that we use every day, even from the speakers I'm using to my laptop and the chips that we use our through our technology, is also housed underneath the emissions that is caused by it, and that goes when they're under as calculated in China's GHGs. Next slide, thank you. So this question is about the US economy, so it's more US focused. So the question is, how much will unchecked climate change cost the US economy by 2070 in trillions? So it's not even millions and billions, it's completely out. Just guessing now in trillions.
That trillions again. Here we go.
Yeah. So there should be a Slido question. Okay, so we see like in between or something that says like at least 7-ish. So there's, I guess, there's 7 trillions. And then we have, okay, we have extremes. All right, so we have zeros. We have 7-ish, and we have 15.
It almost looks like a sea monster coming up.
Yeah. We can go to the next slide. So actually, so those of us who voted towards the more heavier end of that spectrum, or towards 15, is actually are correct. So that same study that I mentioned before found that the U.S. would actually suffer $14.5 trillion in economic losses, and in terms of GDP, that would be $1.5 trillion reduction as well.
Quite a bit. It's hard to wrap your head around these big numbers.
Yeah, I know. So this one also is another one, multiple choice. Which action is better at reducing greenhouse gas emissions? Out of these 4 options here.
All right. We got a tie. Anyone going to break the tie? Oh, there we go.
All right. To the next slide. All right. So energy efficiency retrofits for the wind. So when we were talking again, most of our buildings are still pretty old, and is the first thing to do or first thing to look at is actually how do we retrofit these buildings to reduce the amount of energy that they use every day. And this can actually result to up to energy savings of up to or even greater 50%. So of course, this looks like, again, changing what's considered the envelopes, or think of the walls or windows, as well as switching out energy tools or things that we use to fuel our energy. So i.e. heat pumps, for example. Next slide or question. Thank you. All right, so to make, this one's also agree or disagree. So to make housing affordable, we have to forego making them energy efficient, which means it's basically an either or. All right, so I believe the consensus will actually disagree, which is very true. So housing actually is also a climate change issue. It's not really either or. What might be affordable housing today may not be affordable housing tomorrow, just based on the impacts of climate change, as well as particularly who's living in affordable housing. And that's now speaking about an inequality piece that's coming into play. All right, I believe this is our last question. So weather is a deterrent to active transportation uptake, and active transportation means anything that you use that doesn't require a vehicle. So bicycling or cycling, skateboarding, walking, jogging, you name it. Basically anything you can do to get around without, or walking, without use of a vehicle. All right, you see it's one true and a false, okay. All right. So actually it's false. So there's actually research done by the Clean Air Partnership. So it's a Canadian led organization. They did research to figure out, okay, why are people not participating in active transportation to a certain extent. And they actually found it wasn't weather, it was actually infrastructure, as well as trip length and ability to switch modes. So basically, can I bring a bike on my bus and then come off the bus and use my bike? Or as well as, is that infrastructure actually relevant or prevalent in my community? And also, how far are these infrastructure or these spaces as well? So weather is not it. So there's people biking in the snow. But in the chat, let us know if there's anything that from this game that you've actually found surprising.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for participating, and keep that link open. We'll coming back to get your feedback after Brittany has presented her slides. All right, so thank you very much, Kiana, and thank you everyone for participating, and over to Brittany.
All right, thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed the game. Now we're going to talk about climate planning. So I'm going to describe to you how we plan. So our principles for climate planning are to develop clear pathways of action over time. So we know that climate change is a crisis right now, but there are big structural changes that need to happen, all kinds of assets that need to be replaced. And so we develop clear pathways. We work closely with the county and other stakeholders to say, okay, where is the energy being used in the community? Where are the emissions coming from? And what are the sectors we need to tackle, and what are the actions? We align with federal, state, and international requirements. And wherever possible, we try to find synergies between policies and programs that are happening at those other levels. We develop metrics to monitor, adjust, and justify investment. So we do know that plans are great, but you need to use adaptive management when you hit the ground running and really start implementing in the real world. And you need to check and see if what you thought was going to have an impact is having an impact. We focus on an equitable transition to sustainability. So we're very focused on, what are the impacts of making one change in the system, who's impacted by that, what unintentional consequences might there be, and who pays. And I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we look at ways to maximize co-benefits and minimize harms. These can be different in some communities, and some communities may value benefits and harms differently. But an example of a co-benefit is when we transition away from the current vehicle stock we use towards low emissions or emissions-free vehicles. Typically, we get better air quality. So it's outside of the emissions reductions, but it certainly has a different benefit in the community. All right, so the way that we approach the actual planning process, it's a very iterative approach. We're in the midst of it right now. It's both technical, highly technical, and engagement led. So the technical pieces are modeling, which I'm going to describe to you in a moment. But once we know the energy and emissions that are occurring in a community, we can work closely with the community to figure out what actions are going to decrease those emissions. So what do we need to do in buildings, in the transportation sector, etc.? How much work do we need to do, and how fast can it or should it happen? And again, this relates back to the target that the Board of Commissioners set. And then we also look at how to sequence actions to maximize the benefits. So in a lot of cases, we find, it doesn't always make sense to, let's say, put solar on the roof of a house that hasn't been retrofit, because you're going to have to buy more solar panels because that home uses more energy. So we would recommend going in first a lot of the time, doing some energy efficiency upgrades, replacing those windows, doors, adding insulation, and then adding a smaller amount of solar, because that can take care of the needs of a more efficient building. At the same time as we're figuring out these technical pieces, we're doing engagement, and they influence each other back and forth. So we were always looking for the local opportunities. So again, where are there synergies with other programs and policies? What's the local context like? We look at what are the local constraints and challenges. So these can be, political, they can be legislative, They can do with attitudes and behaviors around climate change or things like energy efficiency. They try to understand the support that's needed and wanted by residents. And again, the co-benefits that are being valued in the community. So those feed back and forth into each other. We need to know the pathway to get somewhere. We need to know if that pathway is going to work for the community. So we'll get into the technical modeling a little bit more here. There's really 4 phases to technical modeling. So we do baseline modeling, really answers the question, how is energy being used throughout the community and what are the sources of emissions? For Clackamas County, we've used 2018 as the baseline modeling, or as the baseline year, sorry, because we have good data available for that year due to the census. Then we do business as plan modeling. So we move forward from this point in time to projecting out over time what the emissions and energy use in the community could look like with the current policies and practices that are in place, both at the county level, at the local governments within the county, at the state level, and at the federal level. So in that piece, we consider everything that is adopted and being implemented, but we exclude anything that is maybe, we've been working on this, but it hasn't been endorsed yet by the board or something like that. And we do our low carbon modeling. So those first 2 phases really let us know what the future could look like without additional action. So a lot of the time when we're working in communities, or communities bring us in because they know that the work they're doing isn't going to reach the target that they've set. And so once we have an idea of how big the challenge is, then we can come in with low carbon modeling and start bringing in actions that make sense based on best practices and the local context, and figure out how to really augment the energy use and resulting emissions in the community to meet the target. And then along with that, we do financial modeling to understand how much it's likely to cost to implement the low carbon pathway that comes out of that low carbon modeling. This is just what it kind of looks like in the model. It's a pretty complex model, and I won't get into any more detail. It looks at actions individually and how they behave together and what happens if you stack things in stack actions in different orders. So it is a spatial and time-bound model, meaning we look at the whole community and then we break it down into sections. We call them traffic zones, so smaller spatial units, and then we look at what happens with the energy and emissions over time as things like demographics change, population grows, buildings change, and more buildings are added, things like that. And now the engagement. So I mentioned we're doing engagement alongside this. So typically we start our projects with engagement planning, do pre-engagement interviews with community members, try to understand who we should be talking to, and understand a little bit of the history in the community around climate action planning. And then from that, we're able to do some engagement planning activities and develop an engagement strategy to really finalize what engagement will look like in your particular community for the project. Then we go into this period of active engagement, which we're in right now, and we implement the engagement strategy. And we carry out different engagement techniques like this presentation and discussion this evening. And we engage right up until the end of the project. In the final report, you'll see an engagement summary in the report, and then we'll do a presentation back to decision makers on the whole plan with engagement highlighted if requested. And just so you know, some of the active engagement we're doing these community conversations. There are focus groups happening or facilitated discussions. There's that community advisory task force that have been with us throughout much of the process. So there's a few different ways that engagement is happening, along with some communications on the website. We look at energy and emissions, from a planning hierarchy. What we typically look at is these 5 pieces: avoid, reduce, replace, remove, and offset. So what that means is that wherever possible, we look for ways to avoid activities that are generating emissions or require energy when they're not necessary. So we're not looking to send anybody back to the Stone Age here, but how do you avoid energy use that isn't necessary? Then we look at reducing energy, so using less energy, avoiding wasting energy. So a lot of this looks like our energy efficiency activities that we talked about earlier, like insulation, doors, windows, when you're looking at a building. Then we look at replace, so switching to renewable energy sources, so switching away from a fossil fuel to a renewable source like wind or solar. And then there's removal, so using natural systems or technology to sequester greenhouse gases to make sure they're not emitted into the atmosphere. And then offsetting, investing in emissions reductions initiatives to decrease their costs and address local emissions that can't be eliminated for lower costs. So typically the space we play in, we talk about avoid some, and that often comes down to behavior change. So there's a lot of education to be done there. And certainly governments can play a role in that. And then we look a lot in our model at reduce and replace. So we look at those efficiency opportunities, using less energy, changing technologies. We look at replacing and moving over to renewable energy sources. The remove and offset, we sometimes do add those to our plans, not always. What we find is in a lot of communities, communities often pay for offsets. And so what that means is that money is leaving the community and there's no return on investment. And so if a change can be made at the local level, like reduce or replace activities, often there's an economic benefit to a community, such as job creation and stimulating the local economy. And also things like saving energy in a home. So there are payoffs there. Now, that's not true for every community about the offsets and removal, because there are programs in place where certainly people within the community do benefit from some of those programs. It's just not true across all of our communities that we work with. This is what it looks like when we develop a pathway. So this is a nice complicated little diagram here, but I'm going to walk you through it. So up at your top left-hand corner there, it says we are here. So that's your baseline emissions. So you can see that's the highest point of emissions in this, fictitious example. The dotted line across the top, you see a decrease in emissions by a little bit going down to the top right. And that's the business as planned in this example. So emissions are decreasing some over time. That's great. But then if you look at the bottom right, that's actually where that community wants to be. That is their target. And so the business's plan does not get there. So then we need to create this low carbon scenario, which is a whole set of actions, switching over to zero emission vehicles, doing building retrofits, going to renewable energy generation. And so each one of those brightly colored line represents an action and the emissions it decreases over time. So you'll see some are starting early on, some come on later and pick up, but they're all contributing to emissions reductions until the target is met. And then the gray space underneath is what we call the carbon liability, or the emissions that are still in the atmosphere. All right, so I think I've basically gone over this, but to put it into context, what you really just heard me talk about is, we go into a community, explore the local context, understand, everything from legal authority of the county to what the state is up to how people feel about climate change, to demographic and housing projections. And so we collect all that information and data, and that helps us develop a good sense of the community, and it helps us develop our baseline. Then we move on to developing that inventory, the actual baseline, and the business's plan, so projecting out to the future. If a target isn't already set, then we work with the community to help with that. In this case, in Clackamas County, there was already a target, so that was good. We already knew where we were headed. We do the low carbon pathway that I just showed you, financial analysis, And then we don't leave you hanging there. We work on the how, the implementation. What does implementation look like in the community? Who does what? And then, of course, we leave with a monitoring and evaluation framework. And then one last piece here. Basically, we look at mitigation. There's two parts to climate change, climate action. So there's mitigation, which is decreasing the greenhouse gas emissions. So that means addressing the cause of the problem, trying to slow it down and trying to stop it. And then there's adaptation. So that's addressing the impacts. Mitigation is what we've been talking about so far this evening, all the buildings changes, all of the transportation changes. Adaptation means, basically the climate, we're a bit of a runaway train here. Even if we address it, we are going to see some climate change at this point. And so how do we minimize floods, wildfires, extreme weather damage? And so there is some synergy between those two pieces. Some of the actions overlap, like green infrastructure, protecting our buildings and sealing them up, things like that. All right, at this point, I'm going to ask if there has been any questions in the chat about climate planning before I move us on to the next section.
We had one question that's been answered by Eben. It was about the model. Does the modeling include the planned I-205 toll project? Eben, did you want to sort of share your answer with everyone? Or I can read it out. So for a standalone estimate of the increased greenhouse gas emissions from the expansion of I-205, there are other tools that could be used outside of this project. Any other questions? Feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute you, or if you want to ask them in the chat, go right ahead.
All right, we'll move on to the next section. And if any questions come up, do feel free to put them in the chat as we go. All right, so let's talk about Clackamas County. Let's talk about the greenhouse gas inventory, the baseline, and then we'll talk about the business as planned. So greenhouse gas inventory is basically, it allows, like I've said, for the county to understand the nature of recent energy use and resulting community emission patterns and sources. And so in Clackamas, what we've learned is that there's 49 million metric million British thermal units of energy being used across the whole community. I'm going to put that in context in a moment here. It's about 118 MMBTUs per person. And then on the emissions side, it's about 4.1 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalents, or 9.8 metric tons per person. And to put that into context, to stay within the 1.5 degree warming threshold that's being recommended by the world's leading climate scientists, and to address global equity concerns, emissions should be about 2.9 tons per person by 2030. So right now, Clackamas County is about 3 times that, but we're still a bit away from 2030. So. All right, let's look at that business as planned future. So just a note on the business as planned, and this applies to the low carbon as well. These are scenarios. And so a scenario is an internally consistent view of what the future might turn out to be. So it's not a forecast. So I always say, I can't predict the future. Our modeling team is great, but they can't predict the future either. But it's one possible future outcome based on the information that we have. So we use a lot of data from good sources, the county, the state, the federal government, the census, past trends in energy use and emissions in the community, understanding about utility transition plans, all of that. And so that helps us understand, what is likely to happen in this community based on what's happening today, what's happened in the recent past, and what's planned for the future. But the real world is the real world. And so a few years ago, I don't know that any of us would have predicted a global pandemic at the scale that we saw and the disruptions from that. or the war in Ukraine that is currently disrupting global fuel supplies. So these things happen, and so that changes predictions, it changes projections. We're still not seeing things like the current war. The data isn't there yet to show the impact that that's had on fuel prices, for example. So we're not, we don't have that available to us. Okay, so in the businesses planned, again, we take that data from the county and the other trusted sources. We look at the policies and plans that are approved or underway. We interpret that data and information, and then we create these projections on these different factors, and we model them together to get a businesses plan scenario. And this is what it looks like for Clackamas County. So this is energy. We'll start there. Energy use increases a bit over time in Clackamas. In the transportation sector, it decreases a little bit. And then you'll see residential, commercial, industrial, those increase a bit. So that's all happening in buildings. And so to break down what's happening here, basically in the transportation sector, more and more electric vehicles are coming online. You know, even in a business as planned scenario, there's going to be more electric vehicles without any more effort than what is currently in place. Not only can electric vehicles be run on renewable sources, but the engines are just more efficient. So that's where you see the decrease in energy use. And then in buildings, that is mostly attributed to population growth. So overall, people are getting more efficient in their energy use in their buildings, but we just have more people that are going to be living in Clackamas County, and so that does have an impact. This is just a look at it by fuel type. So you see what I was describing before. Gasoline is decreasing, grid electricity is increasing. A lot of that is due to that switch in the transportation system. Also, the grid electricity has a little bit to do with the increase in population and buildings. And then you also see a little bit of an increase in natural gas for the same reason. If we look at emissions, they go down a little bit. So they go from about 4.1 megatons to about, I believe it's about 3.3. And so you see a dip there in 2020, 2021, pandemic. Things kind of slowed down, especially in the transportation sector. And then we're seeing the emissions decrease just slightly in the transportation sector as we move to some of those more low emissions options. And then that efficiency gets kind of gobbled up by an increase in vehicles overall. And also keeping in mind that at this point in this business's plan, the electricity grid is not 100% renewable or green. So that means that your electric vehicle in this scenario is not actually 100% green and being run on green energy. We see a decrease in residential, industrial, commercial, and that's due to the electricity grid getting greener and the emissions factor decreasing. From a fuel perspective, you'll see what I was just talking about. So grid electricity, you're really seeing that change there. It's a little bit volatile in the middle there. So, but overall, the emissions from the grid electricity is decreasing. Gasoline decreases a little bit with the switch over to electric vehicles. Everything else stays relatively consistent. So if we look at things on a per capita basis between 2018 and 2050, things look, they look pretty good. So you're decreasing from 9.8 metric tons per person to 5.7. That's good. We'd like to see a downward trend, but it does not meet that pink star down there at the bottom, which is 0, which is where we want to get to. Similar thing on the total emissions. So we don't see as dramatic as a shift either. Again, like I said, some of this has to do with population growth. So per person, less emissions, more people, we don't see as dramatic as a trend in the overall emissions. So down to 3.3 megatons, but a little distance from the target there. I also just want to note really quickly that Clackamas is interested in looking at consumption-based emissions. So that's emissions from products that you consume, not just your buildings, transportation, etc. And so if we look at consumption-based emissions, people like stuff. And so those emissions do increase over time. And that would move, if we counted those, it would move the county up from about a little over 7 megatons of emissions up to over 8. So over the time span. All right, I'm gonna pause there for any questions.
So we have one from Marty asking, how long do you anticipate the process taking?
To complete the plan?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can, if the county wants to add more detail, they can, but the plan is for this to go to the Board of Commissioners in 2023.
Great, thanks very much for that question, Marty. Any other questions? That's the only one I have so far in the chat, but feel free to ask more questions in the chat if you'd like, or raise your hand and we'll come and unmute you.
All right, I'm going to kick it to our next session or next section. And again, if anybody has questions, please go ahead. I'm going to look at some of the opportunities and challenges for reducing Clackamas County's greenhouse gas emissions. And then we'll go into our engagement session. So really based on, you saw a lot of emissions in buildings and in the transportation sector in those charts that I showed you. And so really we see these kind of 5 areas being key for community emissions in Clackamas to decrease. So we need to look at existing buildings. We have buildings of all ages in Clackamas County, all different types of buildings. Some were built before there was code. Some were built when the code didn't really look at energy as much. And so there's certainly improvements that can be made to many of the buildings to make them more efficient. Then when we look at new buildings, those are important as well. New buildings, of course, buildings are long-lasting assets, so they're going to be around for 50+ years likely. And if we're trying to get to zero, it doesn't make a lot of sense to build buildings that are still sources of emissions if they're going to have to be retrofit to become, zero emissions anyway. So, we need to move towards zero emissions buildings in order to meet that target in 2050, or there's going to be a big cost associated with retrofitting those buildings to meet the target. Energy generation, of course, can support energy use in buildings being renewable and emissions free. And also it can support the transportation sector and other sectors. So that's really important as well. Transportation, of course, there needs to be a move towards low emissions vehicles. The biggest sector, emission sector in Clackamas is transportation. And so there is a need there to move towards those lower emissions vehicles, but also looking at the active transportation and the transit system. All 3 of those pieces are important. We can't expect that everybody's going to give up their vehicle and move towards active transportation and transit all the time, but they should be viable options for folks. And hopefully we would see more people using those in the future. And then on waste, of course, there are emissions coming from waste currently. And so we want to see a decrease in waste, and also, just from the consumption-based emissions that reduce, reuse, recycle perspective of, can we reduce the amount of waste in households and the amount of waste going to the landfill. So based on what we've seen and what we've learned so far, we're pulling out some opportunities and challenges in each of these areas. Some of the opportunities around existing buildings are state, utility, and county incentives and rebate programs do already exist. There's actually quite a bit out there. But there are some challenges. The scale of retrofits required. So a lot of buildings need to be retrofit. there's really a patchwork of incentives and rebates to navigate. So not that they don't align necessarily, but it's just a lot to navigate if you're a resident, because there is so much out there. So it's kind of a happy problem to have. We just need to make sense of all that's out there and how people can take advantage of that. Equity, of course, how do you deal with people of varying incomes and homeowners versus renters? How do you make it fair for everyone to retrofit their existing buildings? We look at new buildings, again, state and utility incentives and rebate programs are out there. There's the Oregon REACH code, which can be adopted by municipalities to require a more stringent energy code than the state requires, but the county is not able to put that in place. It's only for municipal governments, city governments. Challenges are, again, education on the costs and benefits. So a lot of people can think it's really expensive to build net zero. It's really not. And so we need a lot of education there. Again, that patchwork of incentives and rebates to navigate is another important challenge. Energy generation. So the Oregon House Bill 2021 has been passed, and that means that all electricity in Oregon should be emissions free by 2040. In Clackamas County and in Oregon, there's already the ability to purchase carbon-free electricity from Portland General Electric, and some businesses and residents are already doing so in Clackamas County. So that's really encouraging. On energy generation, we really look at, the scale of the challenge again. It's a big system, it's big fixed assets. And so transitioning to a new system is going to be, quite the feat. Navigating programs again on things like local home scale or business scale renewable energy opportunities can be difficult, and equity. So we do see sometimes we don't want anybody to, we don't want to get in a situation where people with the money available to them can say, put on solar panels, but there's all these fixed costs on the grid system, and it makes it more expensive for people that couldn't afford to move over to home scale renewable energy. So there's some things to figure out there. Transportation. So there's a federal electric vehicle target. So that's encouraging, along with some targets around production, domestic production. Intensification targets in urban areas. So we know if there are more people in one area, and especially if there's mixed uses, it makes active transportation and transit more viable. So that's an encouraging sign. And there's also updates to the transportation and active transportation plans coming. And so that's a good opportunity to really think about climate change in relation to those plans. Again, on the transportation side, scale of the challenge, this is one of the big areas for Clackamas County, as it is in many communities across North America. We're a car-centric culture. Behavior change is required. So this is one of the ones where it's really difficult for the county to reach in and require any sort of change. It's really an individual decision. So we need to think about ways that the county can maybe influence or support. Connecting rural and urban areas. So Clackamas County is a pretty diverse place as far as land use and communities go. And so how do you offer solutions for those different communities, and how do you connect those communities? And again, equity, there's a cost associated with moving to a different vehicle type. And there's also access to transportation and who has the ability to access transportation and transit and active transportation. And on waste, some of the opportunities, there's already a pay-as-you-throw system, so that's good. So it's kind of a polluter's pay sort of idea. There's a move towards extended producer responsibility system at the state level, which can be encouraging. It means that the manufacturers of waste are responsible for paying to make sure that gets recycled properly. So hopefully there's, that gets implemented. Some of the challenges, the system is not consistent across the county. So there is some privatization. There's some different systems going on. And so that can make it really complex to address waste reduction. And then opportunities for composting are limited in some areas. I'm going to go over the next steps really quickly here, and then we have time for a couple of questions if there's any, and we'll get into our engagement opportunity. So basically, as we move forward, we are finalizing with the county and with some of our stakeholders the low carbon actions that will be, that will be available in the model. And then from there, we need to move on to talking about how we actually implement low carbon actions. And we do that in sort of an iterative way. So part of what we want to talk to you about tonight in this conversation is how we do some of that, or what the barriers might be for climate action. So we're looking forward to that discussion this evening. When we do develop the low carbon pathway, I just want to assure you it will reflect the local context. It will achieve the target set by the Board of Commissioners, or explain the gap if there's some extraordinary reason why we cannot get it there. And that would totally be based on the local context, where we just say, you know what, there are some, circumstances going on here that we need to address before it's realistic to hit that target. And it will align with best practices, of course. And so this is, I've already explained this, we're moving from the what, the modeling, to the how, and that looks like education, programs, policies, initiatives, investments, and how to achieve that sort of new physical reality, that new low carbon community that we modeled. All right, so now we want to hear from you. So I'm going to turn it back over to Naomi and Kiana to take us through this part. Thanks so much for sitting through that a long presentation. And if you do have any questions, do put them in the chat, please.
Great, thanks very much, Brittany. All right, Kiana, what do you got for us?
Great. So another reminder again, if you haven't joined us in Menti, either open a new browser or use your phone and type in menti.com and use that code 12669524. There's also the Menti link in the Zoom chat. Thank you, Naomi. And the first question that we have, once you log in, you might actually see this pop on your phone or on your browser, is do you have any burning ideas to decrease emissions in Clackamas? So again, anything that you might have thought of as Brittany was speaking, you can pop them in here. And even if it's a half thought, that's also great as well. So I'll give folks some time to do that. Right, so we have consume less, which is always a good thing to do as well.
And if you are having any trouble getting in, you can leave us messages in the chat there, or even raise your hand and we will answer you. Programs to renovate homes for emissions. Yeah, I agree. Very important.
We'll give a few more moments for some other thoughts. And if you're having trouble with Menti, you can also put your ideas or answers to the questions in the chat.
Yeah, this is a big topic of conversation, I think, in a lot of the communities we work in, especially the bike share and scooter, e-scooters were really introduced into the larger cities. And now we're seeing them move into smaller cities, more suburban areas, which is really interesting, more bus service. Can the county do anything to encourage retaining old growth and large trees? Yeah, that's something that we've been talking about a little bit. If you can do physical efforts instead of using a machine, do it. Yeah, I agree. All right. Let's, should I move us along to the next question?
Go ahead. So this is also another open-ended question we have for you folks, and is asking, what barriers do you face in taking climate action? So what is stopping you from taking climate action or making it more difficult? Again, this could be anything. And also could be a half thought. So we also do encourage half thoughts as well. So I see Marty, add Marty's answer on behalf. Says cost of retrofitting for solar. That's always a barrier for many as well. Yep, a common one actually. Transit doesn't serve everywhere. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to read it as well.
Also in the chat is unsure of where to recycle. That is always a conundrum, particularly if you go to different places and spaces. There's a whole different rules for recycling.
Yeah, yeah. It's certainly a patchwork everywhere within, you know, counties, states, the country. You hear that one a lot. Not sure how to start in general. Yeah, that's totally fair. Yeah. It's always good to hear that feedback. Not that, you know, we want to, it's not, you know, it's not a positive thing, but we can work on that, right? I think it's really good to hear that because often, you know, we will hear people say, oh, it's, you know, it's the cost, or sometimes decision makers might think, and I'm not saying this is the case in Clackamas County, that, you know, the cost is a barrier for people, but sometimes it's the education and just knowing what to do, where you go for information, who are the right contractors to hire, like, is there a program you can be a part of? What's the most effective action you could take? So it's good to know these things. I live far away from work, no transit, too far to e-bike. Yeah. There. All right, I'll move us along to the next one here. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this one is actually a ranking question. So your mentee, basically we're asking you to, on these 6 options here, to rank from first being your biggest or your main daily concern to 6th being your least. Ranking, yeah, what are your daily concerns out of these 6 options? And what Menti will do is actually take the average of all our answers and see where we all land.
Let's highlight here too, we don't get on our end any indication of who has answered what to any of these questions. It is totally anonymous on our end, so we just get the data, but not who shared what. So this one, yeah, just like Hannah said, it helps us understand, you know, the other, you know, we all juggle so many priorities, and sometimes it can make it hard to think about climate action. And it's useful for us to know this because sometimes there's synergies between addressing some of these concerns that you might have in your daily life, or the things you need to, you know, pay attention to, worry about. And sometimes it just helps us let us know where people are at.
Person who shared. Wait for more for a few, a bit for a few more. Okay, so Menti's averaging things out. So health and well-being is coming on top right now. And then paying rent or mortgage and access to food or food security are tied for second and third. Then fourth is paying utility bills or water, light, and so forth. And then fifth is climate change. So it's also a tie with paying utility bills. Then last, access to childcare. We can move on from this slide as well. Thanks, everyone.
My screen seems to, there we go.
I was going to say, is it giving you a hard time? There we go.
It is. I get it now.
All right. So this question is also open-ended. So are there any other daily concerns that you face on a day-to-day basis? That was not mentioned, those 6 options. Or that were not, that were not mentioned, that those 6 options. So it could be anything else. Okay, we have a no. Yeah, that's also very real, kind of anxiety. It's a very overwhelming topic, fear disasters.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Oh, wake up.
Yeah. Waking up on time. Yep. Lots need sleep.
I have a built-in alarm, fortunately, sometimes unfortunately. Yeah. It's a 7-year-old child. What that is.
Right, so this question is also an open-ended question. So what challenges do we need to be aware of? So us, the project team, to be successful in reducing GHG emissions in Clackamas County. So this is where we're really leaning on all of you folks for more of that local knowledge and the things that you're seeing on the ground, or you just notice being someone who lives or is connected to Clackamas County.
And you have free reign here. It can go, this can range anywhere from, there's already these great programs in place that you should build off of to, you should be, there are these communities that you should be reaching out to that are really well organized or that can really use your support to, here's something about the social situation or the political situation, or a lot of people are struggling right now. All of that information is good for us to know. So take that in absolutely any direction. Yeah, different challenges for rural and urban living. Yeah. I think we heard that. We've run this session once before with the county, and I think we heard that. Political reluctance, but really important to have policy support at the top. Yeah.
Another good thing for us to know is, do you think there's a lot of enthusiasm or not enough enthusiasm, for climate action, as well in Clackamas County? What do your friends and neighbors think as well is good for us to know.
Oh,
Are
we
we optimistic about climate change efforts? Oh, well, I can't speak for our whole team, but I can answer for myself. Having done this work for 17 years, it's certainly, the biggest challenge I think that we face. And but I see and work with, I'm fortunate to see and work with a lot of communities that are like Clackamas County, making serious efforts, to undertake climate action. So that gives me optimism. Kiana, what about you?
I'll say I'm very optimistic. I think climate change has really evolved to ensure that's including everyone and anything really. And I kind of grew up with climate change, so it's kind of my equivalent to like what was recycling in the past. So I'm always optimistic. I'm optimistic for change and what everyone can do in their own way.
Yeah, I would
Courtney?
agree. So yeah, I think there's, some days I look at it one way and some days I look at it the other. It's disappointing when you see all the countries and all the communities that have missed their targets in the past. We've been talking about this for a long time. But I think in the last few years, I have seen the tides kind of change, and people are actually putting together, similar to what we're putting together for the county, these actual implementation plans. And short term, it used to be you could set a target, it was 2010 and you were setting a target for 2050, and then so the plan just got put on the shelf, right? It was easy to walk away, and now we're looking at people saying, okay, here's where we want to be in 2050, but like, what do we do in the next 5 years? It feels like the tides have changed and it's become more real in the world of planning. I see the behavior change comment coming in. I think all of a sudden this light bulb has gone off, with a lot of governments going, this is a change management problem. And we know how to do change management. We do that with a lot of other things. So it's not that it's not a complicated issue, but I think there's a lot more happening. It's also interesting, everywhere we go now, there's so much youth involvement and so much interest from younger people. And they're making an impact, which is really encouraging.
Inflation being a big issue for working families. It is very hard to think about, and it's a real challenge. Yep.
High gas prices. So I think that plays in as well. Hopefully help move towards EV though. So that's a good way of looking at it. Climate change being politicized and behavior changes needed, particularly around the less people thinking of driving first. So yeah, all fair comments. So thank you for those.
So we have, as a response to that, so this is another open-ended question. And of course, again, anything's off limits as well. So it could be anything under the sun. But what does support look like to you in reducing GHG emissions within Clackamas County? So what can Clackamas County do to support you?
And all those answers are coming in and people are thinking about that. I'll just share that, climate action plans, community energy and emissions plans, whatever name they go under, are a little bit different from other plans that a local government would undertake. So typically a government would develop a plan that they have complete authority and control to implement. So think about, an infrastructure plan, a transportation plan. So the county would have the ability to, dictate the infrastructure or where the roads go or what roads get resurfaced first. The climate action plan is a little bit different, where it is a community-wide target. It does require the effort of all sectors in the community, residents, businesses. It's a big challenge, so it's going to require the effort of utilities, other levels of funding. Other levels of government and funding along with that. And so the county plays one role in getting or many roles, I guess, in getting the community to carbon neutral. But they can't be the only actor. There has to be other actors when you're looking at a plan of this scale. And so we kind of frame it in a way of when we talk about it, where can the county lead? What can they do? So that might be setting policies, doing retrofits in their own buildings, something of that nature. Where can they support? So support residents, are there programs, initiatives, education that you need? And then advocacy is also a piece of it. So what's not happening or what needs to happen that the county doesn't have control over, where they may be able to advocate or form partnerships to make something happen. All right, we've got some answers coming in now. Make it easy to find programs to take different climate actions, create rebates for electric bikes and retrofits, make it easier to buy locally grown food and locally made products, create 20-minute neighborhoods, a thoughtful and supportive climate action plan that includes ongoing education for residents. Great, those are all great insights.
I was really happy when whomever, I'm not sure who it was, but we used to say create compact, complete communities. And then finally when people said 20-minute neighborhoods and or 15, I was like, yeah, that makes a lot more sense. It's more intuitive. I know that when my mom came to visit me after I'd come out to Victoria for university, and I just happened to live close to downtown, and so it was a walkable neighborhood, and just walk down 7 minutes to the grocery store, coffee shop, drugstore, movies. You know, she all of a sudden it clicked for her, kind of thing too. But it, you know, so yeah, having those types of places to live, work, and play are really important in all of this too. And yeah, a thoughtful and supportive climate action plan that includes ongoing education. This will be an ongoing educational behavior change process, you know, in the long term too. So having supports like that are going to be important.
Right. Okay, so we're getting to the end here. So if you want to take a moment and tell us anything that surprised you about today's session. And then we're going to get wrapped up here in a moment. So also, while you're thinking through that, if you have any final questions for us, please raise your hand, put them in the chat, and we're happy to answer them in the last couple of minutes we have left here. We're engaging, thanks. New participants, yeah, we always hope to get more people, but luckily this is being recorded, and so it will be shared with folks, and we'll talk a little bit at the end here. I'm gonna pass it back over to the county to tell you about more engagement opportunities, so hopefully we have more engagement along the way. All right, I'm gonna move us along here and start to close this up. So if there's anything else you'd like to share with us today, you can put that in Menti now, put it in the chat, or raise your hand. Naomi or Kiana is going to put an evaluation survey in the chat for you to fill out. If you would, it should only take a minute. It's 3 or 4 questions just to let us know how we did today and if you enjoyed today's presentation. So moving forward, our next steps here with the county and with this project is to finalize that low carbon scenario. And so that means the actions that are modeled, and then we will develop the how along with stakeholder input. And so there's going to be ongoing engagement opportunities. And so that's kind of the next step that'll be ongoing over the next few months. I heard some questions before the meeting. Yes, so I believe we did receive a question about consumption. So yeah, so I'll reflect there on that planning hierarchy that we presented. I hope that's what you're referring to by the questions. So we do look at, avoided use. And so again, a lot of that is education and behavior change. The county can play a role in that and create partnerships as well. So we're talking through some of those actions and some of the implementation mechanisms for that. So we're working on that. And then again, beyond that, we look at the efficiency piece, so the reduction, and then the switch over to renewables and more efficient sources. So it does need to be, more than one piece, but certainly the consumption piece is important, and getting people to reduce, as we saw in that chart that I showed you with the consumption-based emissions. If we include those, and that's something that the county is interested in knowing about, is the community's consumption-based emissions would go up, including those emissions. And so certainly that has an impact at the local level and at the global level. And so they are important to address. We can do some of that through the waste stream, but ideally people would be using less, right, when they don't need. So we are discussing those strategies. So more to come on that. I hope that answers your question. If there's anything else, do put it in the chat or raise your hand. Okay, I think other than that, that is everything for me. So thank you very much again for joining us this evening. Like I said, Naomi is leaving that link in the chat, the evaluation survey, and I'm going to hand it over to the county to close up the evening for us here.
All right, thanks, Brittany. Can you hear me?
Yep, all good.
Great, okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Kiana and Naomi and Brittany, for the presentation and the facilitation today. We really appreciate it. And I want to also thank our community members who took the time to come out and join us this evening. And it's not something we take for granted. We really appreciate you making the time to do it. In the chat, you have seen a link posted by Ellen to the county-wide survey that's available in both English and Spanish. And you can also get to that survey by using the URL that's here on the screen, clackamas.us/sustainability/climate action. Again, there's a link to the survey there and more information about the project. So if you haven't had a chance to fill out that survey, we ask that you do so and or spread the word about it. Well, that's our evening planned for this, and so want to thank you again for joining us and wish you a healthy and safe evening. Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Good night. Do we want to stop the recording?